This is the lesson video for Lesson 2.17, Classification and Taxonomy. In this lesson, we'll be talking about how biologists classify organisms based on their evolutionary history. But before we go into that, let's go ahead and take a look at how biologists have done it before figuring out the system. So most people have grouped organisms into categories based on similarities and differences. And since they had limited technology back then, usually they would base it off of the similarities and differences of physical characteristics. So for example, Aristotle, how he organized organisms was that he first split them up into plants and animals. And then to divide the animals into subgroups, he determined that if the animal had red blood, it would be in one group, and then animals without red blood would be in another. Then he would even divide them further, such as having shelled animals, fish, and birds. And so the key here is that Aristotle based everything off of physical characteristics that he observed because he was able to see these things. Another thing that he used was their behavior and how they moved, which would be like flying, swimming, or walking. And so although that is one way to classify organisms, Aristotle's classification scheme definitely had some inconsistencies. For example, he called animals such as jellyfish and corals zoophytes, meaning animal plant. He felt like they were neither animal nor plant, so he made up a new group for organisms that he thought fit that description. Also, classification by type of movement would place organisms like bats and birds in the same category, but obviously they are very different and they actually are not closely related evolutionarily. So going more into how scientists classified organisms earlier on, we can look at how herbalists developed a plant classification scheme based on how plants were used. So maybe not necessarily how these organisms moved or their physical characteristics, but these herbalists were looking at how they were actually being used. And so, for example, if they were used for medicinal purposes, then they would be grouped in one group. Were they edible? Were they poisonous? All of these different characteristics really describes how the plants were used. The groupings may have helped herbalists at the time organize plants according to their assumed functional properties. Remember, we talked about functional properties is what they did or their job. But the groupings did not, for the most part, inform how the plants were related. They didn't talk much about the history of plants and how they evolved. So eventually, this form of classification was no longer accepted. But these herbalists that came up with this scheme did help classify plants later on. For example, the German botanist Otto divided plants into those that produce flowers and those that do not, which actually is a form of classification that is used today and is a major natural group of plants. Okay, so we see here that the botanist Otto was able to classify plants as those that do or do not produce flowers. So this is one that doesn't, and here's one that does. And so as you can see, there were lots of different ways that organisms were being classified, and so naming them became very difficult. And scientists were not able to agree on one scheme on how to name all the organisms, and so things got very confusing. And the big reason why is because a lot of them were using physical characteristics in order to name these organisms. And so some of them were labeled with more than 10 or more words, which obviously can get very confusing. And so the reason why it's important that all the organisms have, all the scientists refer to the organisms in the same way. Scientists today have all agreed on a certain way to name all organism called the scientific name. And there are two parts to the scientific name. We have the genus and the specific epithet. Okay, so what you can kind of think of this as is this is kind of like a last name, and this is a first name. You share your last name with the people in your family, and it's kind of a family name that you can trace back. Whereas the specific epithet is like your first name, which is unique to yourself. And so an example of this is we can look at maple trees. And so maple trees have a name called Acer saccharum, and it has a common name, which is just like the everyday name of sugar maple. Okay, so this Acer would be the genus, right? And then the saccharum would be the epithet. Okay, so the way that you can see that Acer's like a last name is if we look at a different type of maple tree called the striped maple is its common name, and its scientific name would be Acer pennsylvanicum, right? So it has the same last name or the same genus as the sugar maple tree. And so again, they are closely related because they have that same genus, but they do have unique specific epithets so that it can be distinguished between each other. Okay, so again, this is a two-part naming system, and it's called binomial nomenclature. Binomial meaning two, right? Because we have two names, and it's a way that we're able to name all the organisms. This way, they can all have the same naming convention, and there won't be any confusion. And so here we see another example. We see that that oak trees here have the same genus called Quercus. And so no matter what type of oak you're talking about, they'll have that same genus, but then they'll have their unique specific epithet. Okay, and so again, these are all different types of oak trees, right? They all look different, but they all have that same genus. Okay, so now that we know the naming convention, we can kind of look at how exactly do biologists classify all of these organisms. And so an important word for you to know is taxonomy, and taxonomy is the science of classification, or how we're going to organize these organisms. And how biologists do it today is they organize them based on patterns of evolutionary relationships, how closely certain organisms are to one another. And this type of classification based off of evolution history is what we call phylogeny, okay? So we look at an organism's phylogeny in order to come up with phylogenetic trees, such as this one right here, to show exactly how organisms are related to one another evolutionarily. So we see here that the CA equals a common ancestor, right? So at each of these points, they have a common ancestor, and they branch off of each other, right? And so we see that in this case here, these two types of organisms, the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, are more closely related than the non-vascular plants are to the angiosperm. And so these phylogenetic trees are very useful because they show how closely related certain organisms are. Okay, so just like we just talked about, unlike earlier classification schemes where they were classifying organisms based off of physical characteristics, now biologists use evolutionary relationships in order to classify organisms. And so it's obviously a very taxing job, since there are anywhere between 5 to 40 million different species that exist, but only 2 million of them have been discovered and described. And so as new species are being discovered, they are being named and then placed into the overall phylogenetic trees, where we can see where they fit into the evolutionary history. So previously, taxonomists used physical structures, like we talked about, in order to classify organisms. So we see here, like we would classify these organisms in similar groups because we see a long neck, right? We see their beaks are almost similar too. I mean, they have feathers, right? And so you would be tempted to classify them in similar groups. And all birds actually do belong to the same class or group called aves, but they are placed in different subgroups based on things like beak size, shape, leg type, their feathers, and other characteristics. However, today, what we really do rely on most in order to figure out the evolutionary history and place of each organism is by looking at DNA evidence, because that's not subjective. We can look at those sequences and see which ones are more similar to one another. And so from here, just looking at these three birds, you might think that this turkey would be more closely related to the griffon vulture. So we have a turkey vulture and a griffon vulture, and you might think because they have similar characteristics, they probably are more related than either one is related to this stork, which is in the middle. However, if you look at DNA evidence, what they saw was that this turkey vulture is actually more closely related to this stork than to the griffon vulture on the right hand side. And so obviously you can't rely 100% on physical characteristics, but you can look even deeper within at the DNA sequence to really see which organisms are more closely related. Okay, so to summarize what we went over today, we went over taxonomy, which again is the study of classification, right? And taxonomy helps us group organisms, right, or organize organisms, looking at their similarities and differences. And although historically physical characteristics was heavily relied upon, today DNA structure is the more reliable source. And in a lot of ways, the DNA structure will explain a lot of the physical similarities and differences, but this definitely, the DNA structure is definitely more of the objective one of the two. So two important words that you need to know from this lesson. One is taxonomy, which is the science of naming and classifying organisms based on their natural relationships. And then phylogeny is when we classify organisms specifically by the evolutionary history of organisms.